In this demonstration, I will be deploying DynamoDB using the AWS console. DynamoDB is a basic key value storage solution that can run at a very large scale. In other words, it's a NoSQL type of database solution. It doesn't have a structured schema, unlike if you were using RDS and using MySQL or Oracle. So DynamoDB is designed for enormous workloads and very quick response times when searching for items that it stores. It's also designed to scale automatically to handle peak workload times. So here in the console, in the search field at the top, I will search for DynamoDB and I will select it. Now this is a managed service, much like most offerings in RDS, meaning you don't have to provision a server, you don't have to provision the database software, you don't have to patch the OS or the database software. That's handled automatically. Now, getting started with DynamoDB means defining a table structure, but it's nothing like a rigid schema that you would experience with a relational database system like Microsoft SQL Server or Oracle. For instance, I'm going to go ahead and click Create Table. First thing we have to do is enter a name for the table. Okay, customers. What's the partition key? This is the primary key. And that, of course, stems from the parlance available in standard relational database terminology. Let's say cust ID, the customer ID. We can select the appropriate data type here, but it's going to be string. But we can also add a secondary component for the primary key called the sort key. Anything you would be searching or sorting on often, let's say searching. Let's say the way we're going to use our customer database is that we'll often search for people's accounts based on their mobile phone number. So maybe I'll create a sort key called mobile phone. And again, I'm going to leave that as a string value. Now down below, it's set for the default table settings. We want to see some of those options, so I'm going to choose Customize Settings. You can select a DynamoDB class for standard IA. That's infrequently accessed if the data isn't accessed all of the time. The benefit here is reduced monthly charges. You can also open up the capacity calculator, which is great because we know that database capacity planning is paramount in determining the success of the performance of your backend databases while minimizing cost. So here we could specify the average item size, number of reads and writes per second, to the point where we get a sense of how many read and write capacity units we should configure our database with, along with an estimated monthly cost. So down below, if we want to use those recommended read and write capacity units, that's how we can provision the database, or it can simply be on demand, much like when you fire up an EC2 instance and you pay for it while it's running. Of course, you would still always incur storage charges even if the database isn't running. So I'm going to leave read capacity auto-scaling on. NoSQL databases are designed to scale at a massive level. I'll leave the default minimum and maximum capacity units of 1 and 10 with a target utilization of 70%. And I'll leave the same settings for write capacities. Of course, depending on the nature of your app, you might have a lot more reads if it's a heavy querying type of usage application. And if I want to create secondary indexes on other data items that are not part of my primary key, I can do that. Down below, for encryption of data at rest, if we are mandated perhaps by regulations to have control of encryption keys, we could use the option where we have keys stored in our account that are owned and managed by us, as opposed to having variations on Amazon or AWS managed keys. But I'll leave the default for that. And I'll click Create Table. Okay, before we know it, it's been deployed. So we've got our customers' DynamoDB table shown in the list here with the status of active. It also reflects our partition key configuration and our sort key configuration. The S in parentheses, of course, is string. That represents the data type. And we've got read and write capacity mode enabled with auto scaling. If I click on the customer's table link to open up the details for it, this is where we'll have some general configuration information as well as some standard table metrics related to reading and writing of items in the table. But up at the top, I can choose to explore data items, where the item is actually like the row or the record equivalent of what you would have in a relational database environment. So for the customers table over on the right down below, the item is returned to 0 because we haven't created any items yet. Now, normally this would realistically be done programmatically, maybe with a web front end or some kind of data ingestion service. But here in the GUI, we can at least get a sense of how it looks and feels. So I'm going to choose Create Item, and it presents me with my attributes, or columns or fields, if you will. So a cust ID, let's say ABC123, and the mobile phone. I'll just fill in a fictitious number. And I'll choose Create Item. And this is basic NoSQL storage. So now our item is showing now with the customer ID and a mobile phone item listed. Notice that when you're creating an item, you can also add a new attribute at that time, such as Boolean, which is a true or false value. Let's say a preferred customer. We'll add that. It's either true or false. Let's go ahead and add a second customer here. And I'm going to set preferred customer to true. And I'll create the item. All right, so now down below, we've got our two items. If I open up the second item, notice that preferred customer is showing here as a Boolean value set to true. Up at the top, we can also create a query. I can click Add Filter, and I can specify an attribute name. Let's say the cust ID, which is a string value equal to or perhaps not equal to, and we have a list of operators available here. Greater than, between, exists, not exists, contains. And I'll set it to equal to ABC123, and then down below, I'll just go ahead and run the query. Down below, the items returned, of course, is 1 because we have a customer with that ID.